So, in this article, in this essay, I had you guys read Virtue Theory and Abortion. Hursthouse has two aims. They tie in together, but two different things she wants to do. And the first thing she wants to do is to defend virtue theory from a common charge. And that charge is that virtue theory is useless for thinking about contested or controversial issues. You know, and I myself am a bit sympathetic to this charge, right? I think virtue theory is very useful for thinking about what kind of person you might want to be, what kind of life you as an individual might want to lead. But it does seem to me much less useful than Kantianism or utilitarianism when we start thinking about, well, how do we settle serious disagreements with other people? If I have an idea of what a good life looks like, then I can start thinking about traits of character that are going to help me live a life like that. If I think about what kind of life I might want my kids to have, well, it will help me think about traits of character I might want them to pick up or not pick up. But if you just fundamentally have a different idea about what a good life is, I don't know that, virtue theory might not be that useful, right? Hursthouse wants to meet this charge. She also thinks, and this is closely related, that through virtue theory, not only can it tell us something about abortion, if virtue theory can tell us something about the virtue abortion, which is a controversial issue if anything is, that will meet this first charge. But also, she thinks that it not only can meet it, but it will give us a more nuanced and better account than utilitarianism and Kantianism will manage. Okay, so how is that? Well, Hursthouse says, let's notice something odd. She doesn't actually put it this bluntly, but I think this is a good way. I think she has this in mind, and I think this is a good starting point. We might think that people who reach opposite decisions in superficially similar cases haven't done anything wrong or even have acted rightly, right? Think about the case of Down syndrome, right? I tend to think that certain people would not have acted wrongly if they choose to bring a fetus with Down syndrome to term, right? One of my family's very good friends has a child with Down syndrome, and I think that they have done an admirable thing having this child and providing for him as well as they have, right? On the other hand, my wife and I were older when we had kids. We had the genetic screening, and I don't know what we would have done if our kids had shown up with Down syndrome. But I think it's very possible we might have chosen to terminate the pregnancy, and I certainly wouldn't condemn anybody in our position who did, right? We are older. Child with Down syndrome is going to need constant care. They're probably going to live in their 50s or 60s, math being math. We are probably going to die when they're in their 30s or 40s, right? Not be able to care even before that. We didn't face this situation, and I have no idea what we would have done if we had. But I certainly would not condemn anyone who chose to terminate a pregnancy in that case. Well, that seems odd, though, right? If you're a Kantian, if you think a child with Down syndrome is a person, seems like right thing to do is to carry to term in both cases. If you don't think it's a person, seems like it should be clear that it's not wrong in either case, right? Utilitarianism, even clearer, in the pregnancy, the right thing to do. It is weird that you could think it would be Kantianism or utilitarianism. It is weird that you could think the decision to have this child could be admirable, or a child in these cases, and also that the decision not to might not be blameworthy or might even be the right thing to do. There's a lot of other cases like that. That's just the one that springs to mind for me. And also, both have trouble accounting for the fact that the reasons for the decision matter, or at least some reasons matter, right? If you're a Kantian or a utilitarian, it's very easy to say that profound cognitive impairment matters. For a utilitarian, going to use a lot of resources. For a Kantian, just never going to be a person. But, for things like, should the fact the mother was raped matter? Well, it's hard to build that in if we're obsessed about the question of personhood, or, we're obsessed about consequences. It matters a bit there, but not all that much. The same if, person's life condition, so on and so forth, right? Kantianism and utilitarianism, however they come down, seem to give us way too cut and dried, black and white answers to a question that is, if anything, very hard and very, very, well, it's artificial to give a neat answer, right? Virtue theory can account for the fact that we might praise or certainly not blame people for reaching very different decisions. And it will also be able to account for the fact that there's so much difficulty and nuance in this decision, she thinks. Now, one other thing that I'll add, she thinks in this question of a right to an abortion, we lose sight of the question of the morality of abortion. And I think this is a good point to make, because you can, while acting in your rights, do something very bad, right? Let me give you an example. I have a professor, I'll avoid saying his name just because, whatever. But I knew a guy who divorced his wife just because, tired of being married, just wanted a younger person who happened to be a student of his, right? This did not happen at TCC. It does not reflect badly on us, right? Now look, I think this guy's a slime ball, right? I don't want to be friends with him. I don't know how the divorce went. I hope his wife took him to the cleaners, right? I also don't think, I think he has a right to divorce his wife and to marry one of his students, right? Look, maybe he violates school policy and is going to get fired. I don't think he did. But look, I think people should have a right to no-fault divorce. I think people should have a right to marry who they want to marry, right? You can still be a terrible person in exercising those rights. So the question of, do you have a right to do it, does not settle the morality of it, right? Or take a right to free speech. I think people should have pretty wide-ranging rights to free speech, but you can certainly be a terrible person in exercising your right to free speech, right? So whether or not you have a right to something doesn't settle the morality of it. To some god-awful Holocaust denier have a right to publish his stupid questions asking whether the Holocaust happened? Probably so. Is he a terrible human being for exercising that right? Oh, most definitely, right? So, the question of whether there should be a right to an abortion, if we obsess over it, Hursthouse will say, obscures this question about morality. This obsession with personhood also obscures it. And so Hursthouse will say, look, instead of asking about personhood or rights or any of that, that's not where virtue theory starts. According to Hursthouse, where virtue theory starts, both with abortion and any other issue, is what does this action say about my character, about what type of person I am? And so, the action might say something bad. It might indicate a vice. It might not say anything bad, right? It might even say something good about your character, in which case it indicates a virtue. You know, and think about my earlier cases, right? The guy who just leaves his wife for like a student. You can say, what does that say about his character? Nothing good, right? Holocaust denier, what does that say about his character? Also nothing good. You know, other actions might say something good about your character. We'll leave those aside, right? And so Hursthouse will say, well, what does the decision to have an abortion say about someone's character? Well, it really depends on the circumstances, right? In some cases, it might say something bad, right? It would indicate a vice or multiple vices. Someone who had an abortion because they were planning a vacation and didn't want to miss their vacation, maybe they should have a right to do that. But that would say something bad about their character, Hursthouse thinks. You know, she thinks that bringing life into the world is an important thing, that being a parent is valuable. And if you terminated a pregnancy for those reasons, it would involve a failure to see that, as well as a certain carelessness or selfishness. You know, in a lot of other cases, you know, decision to have an abortion might indicate an obsession with perfection, right? You know, maybe someone wants kids, but this isn't what they think of as the absolute perfect moment. Or you can imagine somebody using genetic, you know, one of these types who's all into genetic engineering and such. They get the profile back and there's no real disease, but they just don't like the way it looks, right? In that case, that sort of obsession with some idea of perfection might indicate a vice. It probably would. In other cases, it might not be virtuous, but it wouldn't show a vice. You know, some 14-year-old who gets pregnant, especially if it's against, you know, if it's sexual assault of some sort, that she judges she could not carry a pregnancy to term, that certainly would not indicate a vice. Remember, virtue theory judges character on a spectrum. Vices are bad, virtue is good, but there's all sorts of states in the middle that are neither. A lot of decisions for an abortion might indicate that, right? And in some cases, it could even indicate a virtue. You know, you might think of the case about Down syndrome. That might even be a way to think of that, right? The parents who, in one situation, who were much younger, choose to have this child, that might indicate all sorts of virtues, generosity, openness to the unbidden, you know, not things necessarily on Aristotle's list, but you might put virtues there. Older parents who wanted a child but wouldn't be able to care for this child might not indicate a vice. It might even indicate a virtue, that they reached this decision. So Hursthouse will say virtue theory allows us a lot more nuance. It's not only a good way to think about this controversial issue, it allows us to model the complexity and nuance a lot better than can Kantianism or utilitarianism. And I think she's probably right. I do think not only is it an interesting way to think about the issue, but I think it might do better in some respects than Kantianism or utilitarianism. I also think, though, in trying to apply virtue theory to this case, she brings up a general problem with virtue theory. I'll talk about that in the next lecture.